I'm going to speak in English. My French pronunciation is absolutely abysmal. I will try to speak slowly. If I'm speaking too quickly, please let me know and I'll slow down. Everyone has a handout, right, with the Greek text, essentially, is the important bit there. Right, there are many problems associated with studying 4th century BCE prose literature, though not nearly as many as studying the 3rd century BCE prose literature, as Cale well knows. And he might well say to me, what's your problem? For the 4th century, even though there is much that is fragmentary, there are at least a good number of complete or nearly complete texts. And this point, of course, I concede. Nevertheless, there are some sources of frustration. We are not, for example, much further on in terms of secure biographical knowledge of our authors, still being reliant primarily upon later biographies and whatever bits of information we decide we can usefully extract from their crafted portrayals of themselves in their own works, as narrators, omniscient or otherwise, or characters, or through statements of direct authorial intervention. To use this type of material to reconstruct their lives also relies upon us being able to understand the purpose of the work in which this material occurs. And this is not always obvious or agreed upon. Thus, we have Xenophon's own account of his campaigning in Asia from 401 to 399, the Anabasis, but the narrative is no straightforward autobiography or memoir. Not only does Xenophon present himself in the third person as a character in the narrative, but the journey is recounted by an anonymous narrator who gives the impression of being an objective reporter accompanying the mercenary group. Further, a narratorial eye surfaces occasionally, but it's unclear whether this is the figure of the anonymous narrator or Xenophon as author. Right. And complicating matters even further is the fact that in his Hellenica, his historical work, Xenophon reports that one Themistogenes of Syracuse, otherwise unknown, wrote about what amounts to be the first 4 books of the Anabasis. Does Xenophon mean us to view Themistogenes as the anonymous narrator or as the author, thus adding a further layer in this creation? Whatever the case, Xenophon has created a deliberate illusion of distance and objectivity around this work, and thus extracting anything other than very general biographical information from the text is not an easy task. Secondly, dating works is a vexed problem. Internal references to specific historical events, if they exist, ought to be a reliable key to establishing a terminus postquem, but of course they are no guarantee of a terminus antequem. And equally, they cannot tell us whether or not even a work like Xenophon's Hellenica, right, which covers events in Greece from 410 to 362, was written slowly and periodically over, say, a 30-year period, or all quickly after the last recorded event. Just decided he'd write a history then. We are on more secure ground regarding his encomium, the Agesilaus, which clearly postdates the death of the Spartan king in 360, and then predates Xenophon's own death in 354. So we have a nice 6-year period there. But even here, when we look at passages which resemble one another in the Hellenica and the Agesilaus, which was written first and which is an altered version of the original becomes dependent upon unprovable theories about when the Hellenica was composed. We're on a little more secure ground with Isocrates, really, because he inserts himself more frequently into his texts, sometimes commenting on his age. For example, in the Panathenaicus, he says how old he is, or he sometimes tells us how long a work was he took to compose it. But this does not work for all his orations and letters. So, for example, one work which I will not talk about today, but which is important for his view on Sparta, the Archidamus, it's an oration placed in the mouth of the Spartan prince of the same name. The dramatic date is 366, and almost invariably that's the date that is given to the oration. But there's absolutely no way of knowing whether or not he wrote it for Archidamus to deliver, all right, or whether it's simply a rhetorical exercise that he wrote for his students, and whether or not it was written close to 366 or he was doing it 20 years later. It's just absolutely, there's nothing that can help us directly with that in the text itself. Thirdly, third problem, with our 4th century prose authors, unless they're directly attacking one another in the courts, in the law courts, they tend to refrain from explicitly naming each other in their works. No meticulous footnoting for them, unfortunately for us. So that sometimes it seems as if they are in conversation with one another, given the material that they're discussing, but we can't be entirely certain, and we have the additional problem that I just talked about, the problem of dating, so we don't know who might be addressing whom, even when we discover something that looks like it's a conversation between them. So, for example, Isocrates, in 2 different works, the Panegyricus and a work called To Philip, makes reference to events that are covered by Xenophon in the Anabasis. An internal reference makes it fairly likely that 380 was the year of the delivery or publication of the Panegyricus. Because of general unprovable assumptions that Xenophon wrote all his works late in life, it is most often argued then that in the Anabasis he is correcting the view that Isocrates presents of the mercenaries in the Panegyricus, and it is not flattering, the view that Isocrates presents. However, internal evidence in the Anabasis provides a terminus postquem of around 388, and that's a conservative one, date. So the Anabasis could still predate the Panegyricus, and the conversation could be the other way around. Most people think the Panegyricus was written before the Anabasis, but some do look at it the other way. But in both cases, right, the conclusion is that Isocrates is likely the more reliable, if you like, account, whether he was correcting Xenophon's too positive version or Xenophon was trying to correct his too negative version. So the conversation is read as a hostile conversation. Yet there's another perfectly reasonable way to read these this conversation. First of all, the rhetorical point that Isocrates is making in the context of the Panegyricus works a lot better if the mercenaries are a less competent group than they most likely were. Right? He's saying even that motley group was able to defeat the Persian king. And it's equally possible that Xenophon recognized Isocrates' rhetorical aims and had no issue with them. Right? Why does he have to be angry about this? And anyway, Xenophon himself does not portray the mercenaries as a particularly noble group, right, if the Anabasis is read closely. So I think his portrait of the mercenaries is less far from Isocrates' summary comments than usually thought anyway. So there are other ways of reading the material, and I'll explain now why I want to pursue this different way of looking at it. It is in fact characteristic when speculating on these just under the radar literary conversations to assume that they are hostile in nature. That's the starting point. But sometimes we are starting from problematic general assumptions about these authors. So, for example, although there has been a very welcome sea change in scholarship on Xenophon, so that we are now viewing him as more interesting and more intelligent than most 20th century scholarship did, we are finally taking seriously the fact that he was actually highly regarded in ancient times and in the early modern period. But the default assumption often is still that others, Plato, Isocrates, Aristotle, are criticizing him, and then he, in turn, is defending himself against such criticism. But I think that this may just simply reflect long-held prejudices rather than what the situation actually was. Of course, prudence is needed in conducting this type of speculative analysis, but I think it's important to consider more closely how these prominent 4th century Athenian authors might have interacted, because we also have too great a tendency to examine authors in isolation, which simply can't have reflected their reality, no matter how difficult it is for us to reconstruct that reality. So, for example, Xenophon may have lived on an estate in Scyllus in the northwest Peloponnese, but this surely cannot have meant that he never left it to travel, or that he was uninterested in what was going on in the wider world, or that he had no actual contact at all with any intellectual other than perhaps through occasional manuscripts or secondhand reports, which eventually made their way to the backwater he lived in, which was actually quite close to Olympia, so perhaps not as much of a backwater as often suggested. Likewise, examining authors in artificially constructed groups during this period of massive experimentation in prose writing is again not likely to represent the messy complexity of literary interaction at this time. For example, Isocrates frequently gets treated with other 4th century BCE orators, not least because of the later grouping together of rhetoricians such as Pseudo-Plutarch's Lives of the 10 Orators. Yet, Plato and Xenophon are no less rhetorically savvy for their own purposes. And though Isocrates is more often compared with Plato and Aristotle than Xenophon is, he, like Xenophon, is generally automatically regarded as inferior philosophically, even though his philosophizing works on a quite different plane. All right, so I think it is good to put them together, but not to assume they're all doing the same thing. So we have to ask how they relate within their own sphere. Xenophon is frequently discussed in isolation, partly because it's so difficult to categorize his works. We find his corpus generally artificially split in many ways, really, but broadly speaking, to examine him as a historian using his supposed historical works, and then as a Socratic, referring only to his Socratic works. And in neither category does he tend to be examined positively with his fellow historians or his fellow Socratics. Happily, right, these trends are shifting as well. There will be an excellent volume on Plato and Xenophon and their literary interaction coming out very shortly from Brill. And there's in preparation a special issue of the journal Trends in Classics on Isocrates and Xenophon. So, we're trying to cross some of these artificially constructed borders to the way we've looked at these authors. So why might we not assume that Xenophon and Isocrates were not just in dialogue, but in dialogue on reasonably friendly, rather than hostile, terms? Certainly, neither directly refers to the other in any of their extant works, but that is not unusual in this period, so ought not to be immediately assumed as evidence of hostility, though it frequently is, also in the case of Xenophon and Plato. But Isocrates and Xenophon have a significant shared background. They're contemporaries from the same deme, Archaea. Isocrates was older by around 6 years, and so we might reasonably rule out a close childhood friendship, though the issue of brothers or sisters and their potential interaction is completely unknown. Right? But it would be odd if the two upper-class families in the same deme were unaware of one another. Later tradition has both Isocrates and Xenophon at some time or other studying with Prodicus, and scholars regularly assert that neither was close to Socrates, which is clearly, I think, crazy in the case of Xenophon at least, and open to the case of Isocrates. The situation of both men was radically altered by the Peloponnesian War, though in different ways. Isocrates appears to have been financially ruined. Xenophon ends up in exile. Both, therefore, had to embark on paths that I would argue neither had likely anticipated as young men. Isocrates worked as a speechwriter before opening up a school in Athens, and Xenophon, after campaigning as a mercenary, ended up on an estate in Scylla, courtesy of the Spartans. Not parallel paths, of course, but I would argue that both still had pedagogic aims and believed firmly in civic participation and being useful to one's polis, and that both promoted these ideas by the means available to them in their altered circumstances. So Isocrates through his school and his orations, and Xenophon through his writings. Both, in fact, also seem to have put their newly earned wealth where their mouths were, in the sense that we know Isocrates performed liturgies in Athens, and Xenophon hosted a yearly festival in Scylla for the community there. So putting into practice this idea of civic participation. Finally, Isocrates is also said to have written an encomium for Xenophon's son Gryllus after his death at the Battle of Mantinea in 362, and this is number 1 on the handout there, the passage. So it's Aristotle says that a huge number of authors composed an encomium or an epitaph in honor of Gryllus, partly also as a compliment to his father. And indeed, Hermippus declares in his work on Theophrastus that Isocrates too wrote a eulogy on Gryllus. Now, this is very late evidence, of course, and there are many problems with things that we find in Diogenes Laertius, but this remark curiously does not seem to prompt much speculation about the relationship between Xenophon and Isocrates, even though it may be that we ought to consider Isocrates among those who wrote to gratify Xenophon. One prominent Xenophon scholar says, after noting this passage, it is interesting that Isocrates and Xenophon ignore one another. How do we know that they ignore one another? Obviously, none of this means that they were friends or even friendly, or that they respected one another, conversed with one another, debated their own positions with one another in a mutually respectful and beneficial way. But I want to engage in a thought experiment here and assume that they did have a mutually respectful and friendly relationship, since in the end, this is really no more of a thought experiment than assuming that they had no knowledge of one another or assuming that they were hostile to one another. So just to see what happens if we read this material assuming that they have a good relationship. I have recently done this with Plato and Xenophon on matters pertaining to Sparta, and concluded that the similarities between Xenophon's Spartan constitution and Plato's description of the Timarchic regime in Book 8 of the Republic are too striking to be coincidental. And it's not just that both agree that Spartan education was too harsh and too limited, that wealth was coveted and accumulated privately in Sparta, and that the regime collapsed when wealth was openly sought. It's also the fact that the language that they both use to describe these features is similar, and they are the only two who are talking about Sparta who mention these factors in this way. All right. So my heretical conclusion is that Plato and Xenophon had a mutually respectful relationship, and that they did converse and exchange ideas with one another, and that in fact Plato may even have deferred to Xenophon on matters pertaining to Sparta, because of all these intellectuals, these Athenian intellectuals, Xenophon is the one with closest ties to Sparta, and who actually for a while is living on their bounty, as it were. So it's just, again, as I say, a thought experiment to try to see what can we say about Isocrates and Xenophon using their assessment of Sparta as a focal point. Right? And this is very preliminary at the moment, all right, and far from being thoroughly tested, but I just have a couple of points to try out. So as I say, I'm starting from the assumption that they have a relationship in which they exchange ideas, letters, manuscripts with one another, possibly in draft form, but this does not particularly matter at the moment for the level that I'm looking at. So again, coming back to one of these problems about dating works, we can't be certain when Xenophon's Spartan constitution was written. I have argued previously that it likely falls within the period 394 to 371, but it doesn't in some ways matter for the points I'm pulling out today at least, because one of the works I'll look at of Isocrates was written after Xenophon died, so quite clearly I'm secure on my chronology there. So what I'm looking for is to see if there is a closer correspondence to the ideas that Xenophon presents in the Spartan constitution, right, in works of Isocrates that are clearly written after Xenophon's Spartan constitution. All right. So just two examples for you. The first one, I've taken a passage from Isocrates' Bucyrus, and this is 2a on the handout. The Lacedaemonians, on the other hand, governed their own city in admirable fashion because they imitate certain of the Egyptian customs. For instance, the provision that no citizen fit for military service could leave the country without official authorization, the meals taken in common, and the training of their bodies. Furthermore, that lacking none of the necessities of life, they do not neglect the edicts of the state, and that none engage in any other crafts, but that all devote themselves to arms and warfare. All these practices they have taken from Egypt. All right, I want to focus on the last one they mentioned, their last practice, and that none engage in any other crafts, but that all devote themselves to arms and warfare. Right. This Spartan practice was not a secret. Right? It's not surprising that Isocrates mentions this, but I'm interested in how it is presented here. There's not complete agreement on the date of Isocrates' Busiris. At the moment, 390 to 385 represents the majority view. So just go with that for the moment. It has, in fact, also been recently argued by two scholars, particularly Niall Livingstone, that Isocrates in the Busiris is parodying Plato's Republic. And here he makes the argument that it must be based on an early draft or something of ideas, because I think nobody would argue that the Republic was written this early. This may be so, right? And I think we have to imagine letters and drafts of material and ideas circulating around, though we, of course, have no direct or very little direct evidence. But what strikes me about this passage is how much closer Isocrates' formulation is in substance, language, and context to that of Herodotus on the same subject than to Xenophon and Plato, who are likewise very similar to each other in how they frame this practice. So I've given you the four passages on number 2 on the handout there, but I won't read through them. Herodotus discusses the separation of manual labor and the military classes in Sparta in the context of a discussion about this practice in Egypt in Book 2, and does not specify any particular activities to be avoided. Neither Plato nor Xenophon connect this practice with Egypt, and they do specify specific crafts and overlap on 2 of them, farming and handicrafts. Now, of course, the problem with this example is that the Busiris is about an Egyptian king, right? So it's hardly surprising to find Egypt figuring as a point of comparison around which everything else flows. Right? And Sparta is elsewhere compared with Egypt, right, in other texts. But, I just suppose for a moment that Xenophon's Spartan constitution is not yet circulating. Certainly ideas connected to Plato's Republic might be, but I would say not the specific formulation which he uses in Book 8, which is so strikingly similar to Xenophon's phraseology. So for the sake of argument, we might imagine that Isocrates' Busiris predates these 2 formulations and thus resembles more general formulations on this particular aspect of Spartan society, such as that found in Herodotus and elsewhere. Now, not the strongest point, I completely admit. I'm on firmer ground here with the Panathenaicus, I think. So what I can see with some of the passages in the Panathenaicus that I'll talk about is I can see the same sort of striking similarities in tone and subject matter, and again, always allowing for rhetorical manipulation for the particular context. But I can imagine Isocrates reading or having talked to Xenophon about the way he thinks about these issues. Right. So, the second example then, the passages are, I've just given you the 4 passages from Isocrates because it would have been too lengthy to put the Xenophon ones on there. Isocrates tells us in this speech that he is 94 years of age at the time of composition, so we have a fairly good idea that this postdates Xenophon. We're looking around 342 or so to 339 for the Panathenaicus. The speech is very complicated. There's lots of problems of interpretation. Generally, the first part praises Athens and attacks Sparta. At section 199, Isocrates pauses to report that he was all set to revise the speech when it occurred to him that he should ask one of his pro-Spartan ex-pupils to review what he had said about Sparta. The ex-pupil praises the speech, to Isocrates' amazement, since it is clear that he's also not very happy about the portrayal of Sparta and the Spartans. And at 201, he declares that, he should be more positive. Isocrates should be more positive because the Spartans, this is number 3A there, sorry, having found out the best practices, followed them themselves and showed them to others. Isocrates, expressing disbelief that the Spartans could actually have discovered these practices since they're far older than the Spartans, bids his ex-pupil to defend his views. And in what follows then, we get some strong criticism from Isocrates about Sparta's education system. Right, so roughly speaking, 209 to 216. His first criticism, and this is 3b, is that the Spartans are so far behind in the ways of common education and philosophy that they do not even learn letters. The second one, 3c, is a bit more general. They accustom their children to pursue occupations which they do not expect to make them benefactors to other men, but to make them as harmful as possible against the Greeks. And then the third one, 3d, a bit longer. They send their children with companions of their own choice in theory to hunt, in reality to steal from those who live in the countryside. The result is that those who are caught pay a fine and receive blows, while those who knew how to commit the greatest infamies without being caught win a reputation superior to others amongst the children. And when they become men, if they remain faithful to the habits acquired during childhood, are well on their way to attaining the highest offices. Others consider wrongdoers and thieves as the worst kind of slaves. These men judge the best of their children to be those who have won first place in such exercise, and they honor them more than all the rest. All right. So the first point of contact to note is the specific summation by the ex-pupil that the Spartans follow the best practices, ta kalista ton epiteumaton. It has not gone unnoticed, and indeed is strongly, and I think rightly, emphasized by Jean Ducas, who's written a very good book on Spartan education, that Isocrates is deliberately alluding to Xenophon's Spartan constitution in his use of the term epiteumata, which occurs not only in the introductory sentence of Xenophon's work, but also at structurally significant points in the treatise. Once one is directed towards the treatise, it is remarkable how closely the three criticisms, even rhetorically exaggerated as they clearly are, in order to provoke the ex-pupil, how closely they echo both specific and general points in Xenophon's treatise, particularly in section 2, where he goes through an account of the education of boys at Sparta. Xenophon does not directly say that the Spartans were so backward in culture and philosophy that they did not even learn letters, but that could certainly be taken as an extreme interpretation of section 2:1-2, in which Xenophon contrasts the emphasis on letters, music, and exercises outside Sparta with beatings, physical exercise, and encouragement of theft inside Sparta. Neither Xenophon nor Isocrates could have believed the Spartans didn't learn their letters, but it was a very handy insult to throw out. The second criticism, that they accustom their children to pursue occupations that actually make them harm others, not benefit them, is a fairly good general summary of a combination of reading Xenophon's section 2 on the education of Spartans and his behavior of the Spartans in section 14, where he says that they don't follow their practices very well and they are greedy, and whereas others wanted them to lead before, they no longer do, etc. But the most striking concordance is with the lengthy third criticism about the practice of encouraging thieving skills. In Xenophon, an equally disproportionate portion of the description of the education system is given over to explaining the role of theft in the upbringing of boys. The skills he says it encourages are those he elsewhere says hunting teaches. Right? Spending nights sleepless, learning to set ambushes, using spies, using deceptive methods, right, in order to teach boys how to become more resourceful in supplies, getting supplies and become more warlike. Xenophon also notes that any boy caught stealing is punished by beating, because it is only right to punish those who do not properly learn what they have been taught. Furthermore, he gives great detail about a ritual public stealing of cheeses from the altar of Artemis or Thea, where the best thief wins the greatest fame. 4 points on Isocrates, and I think 4 pretty reasonable points of contact with Xenophon's work. Contrary to Dukas, however, who thinks that Isocrates is attacking Xenophon indirectly here, again, always this tendency to assume we've got hostile relations, I would like to suggest that Isocrates is happily drawing upon a treatise written by his friend, a treatise which he recognized, as did Plato, and I would suggest Aristotle as well, was not the thoroughgoing praise that it is primarily regarded as today. So 2 examples are hardly enough to make my case properly, but enough, I think, to make the following hypothesis, which will then need to be more thoroughly tested, that prior to the circulation of Xenophon's Spartan constitution, which gave people outside Sparta a very different view, I think, of Sparta than they had previously in some ways. The type of analysis that he provides is very much in line with other Athenian intellectual practices. But prior to the circulation of this work, we can see Isocrates drawing on common images of Sparta from other sources, or that are in the general sort of remit. In his later works, though, perhaps we can see more direct knowledge and him specifically drawing upon, with rhetorical manipulation for his own purposes, Xenophon as an authority on Sparta. But not because he's hostile towards Xenophon or regards him as a naive laconophile. Xenophon was an Athenian through and through. He was also pragmatic. He lived under Spartan sponsorship while it was prudent to do so. But this also meant that he had closer dealings with Spartans than many of his fellow Athenians. And I think they looked to him for information about Sparta and were, for the most part, all on the same page about Sparta. For the majority of them, Sparta certainly held some attraction, but there was much more from an Athenian point of view to criticize. Thank you.